Hi, it's Lori from Common Sense Homesteading, and Amy from Homesteaders of America asked me if I would invite you into my kitchen and do a quick crash course on dehydrating and freeze drying, so here we are. First off, I want to talk about different tools that you can use when you're dehydrating. Obviously, there's the dehydrating agent, different types of commercial dehydrators here, and then there's the tools that you use to prep the food to go in the dehydrator. I'm going to start with the tools to prep food first, and then we'll talk about the different dehydrators. One thing you're going to need, cutting board and sharp knife. You want to slice your food nice and thin so it dries completely and evenly. Then, if you're doing veggies, you're going to need a big stock pot because you generally want to blanch or steam your veggies before they dehydrate. You want to do this because it softens the skin and it makes it easier for them to dry more thoroughly and quicker. Also, if you want to do something like fruit leathers, you're either going to need a food processor or a blender. I have my Vitamix. I use that for a variety of projects in the kitchen, and I'll do my fruit leathers in this because you got to blend up the fruit so that it's smooth and even, and then you spread it on your drying trays. I'm going to set this off to the side. There's another thing that I like when I'm prepping for the dehydrator. I also have my salad spinner. I got this one, gosh, I think it might be as old as my kids. It was $5 at the local hardware store. Works really well. Load it up, and I use this for other veggies, not just salad, so that I get off all the excess water. The drier that you can get your food before you put it in the dehydrator, the more quickly it'll dry. Common sense. All right, let's take a look at some of our different dehydrator options. I like commercial dehydrators for most of my drying needs because they dry quick and even. You can air dry some things like herbs, for instance. I mean, think of the bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, that kind of thing. There are some things, especially if you have your wood stove or you live in a dry climate and have good air circulation, some things will air dry just fine. But for us, we tend to have a lot of humidity, so the commercial dehydrators work a lot better for me. If you don't have a dehydrator, you can also use oven drying, and I've got complete instructions for that on the website. I'll have a link below on that. Otherwise, our commercial options include smaller units like this Nesco Snack Master. Now this starts out with 4 trays that can expand up to 12, and I've got the Ghost of Snack Master Pass. This is my second Snack Master unit. I started with my first one over 20 years ago, and unfortunately the first one died, but the second one is alive and well, and I purchased, here's my original set, here's a couple spares I bought, and then here's the new set. They all fit together, nest together. The Nesco units come in this size, which I think is about 12 inches across, and then they also have a bigger round size. I also advise getting the mesh sheets. These are great for small items like herbs where you want to increase air circulation. And there's fruit roll-up sheets that can go into these. They have a little bit of a rounded lip that keeps your fruit puree neatly spread in the tray. If you want to do any kind of fruit leathers, you really want a tray like that. And some kits, if you get a kit, sometimes they'll include the mesh trays and the fruit roll-up trays in the kit. Sometimes you have to buy them separately depending on what you select. I'm going to set this aside. The new units I like actually better than my original unit because the new unit has the heater and the fan right up here at the top. My original unit had the heater and the fan in the bottom, and occasionally food would, fly loose and fall down into the heater and the fan, and that was not a good thing. So I like these. I do suggest a unit that has a heat control, so this can go all the way down to 95, all the way up to 160, and a fan for air movement. The heat control lets you set your temps more delicate for items like herbs, or if you're using it for a sourdough starter or fermenting yogurt, and then you can crank up the heat for products like meat where you want a higher interior temperature. Another option that I use for my bulk drying is my big bad Excalibur. I really like this when I'm doing big batches of tomatoes or any other veggie. Did a whole bunch of zucchini candy in this, the zucchini gummy candy. There are special sheets that you can buy that are branded for the Excalibur units. Otherwise, you can use this reusable parchment paper. I really like this because all these trays will come out. So when I'm using this for ferments, like yogurt, I can take all my trays out and then put my larger containers of yogurt or other items that I want to ferment in here. You can even use this for proofing bread if your house is cool. Just set it on its lowest temp and then leave it to rest. It'll be 95 degrees, so it's not going to kill your starter. And then you come back and you're good to go. This unit does have a temperature setting on the top and it has a fan in the back, but it doesn't have a timer. Personally, when I'm doing dehydrating, most of the time I'll just set it in the evening and just let it run overnight. You really can't over dry something, but you can under dry it, and we'll get to that in a minute. Let's see. Another option beyond air drying or oven drying is solar drying. This is a sun oven, and they do have special drying racks that you can use and prop up inside of that. And when you're dehydrating food, you want to leave this lid propped open so that as the moisture comes off the food, it can escape. As it heats up, it'll dry that moisture right out. And pass the crack in the slightly open lid, and that will get the job done. If I didn't have these as an option, I'd probably use that more. If it was a bad thing, heating up the house is really a problem. We live here in Wisconsin and we don't tend to deal with excess heat. So usually it's not a big deal to be heating up my house a little bit with the dehydrator. Usually it's a good thing to be adding heat in here. Because this does have, your foods are drying in the sun, it will tend to discolor potentially your foods a little bit more, cook them a little bit more. It's a little bit harder to control because you can't set the temperature like you can in these other commercial units. But if you want to keep your house from heating up and you're drying something and it's not so fussy, it'll work. It'll get the job done. All right, what else? All right, tips for drying food. You want to chop or slice your food so that it's between 1/8 inch and 1/2 inch thick. Thinner is better. The big problem you run into a lot of times with people who said, oh, I tried to dehydrate something and it got furry, is that they had uneven pieces and some of the pieces were still moist while other ones were dry. You want it to get to a leather-like consistency. You don't want it to be still squishy and floppy. It should have some snap to it and be very dry as you can reasonably get it for long-term storage. Typically, when you're dehydrating, you can get your moisture levels down to 90% of the water removed, maybe up to 95% max, but it's never going to be quite as dry as freeze drying, so that's why it doesn't have as much shelf life. When you're working with vegetables, you generally want to blanch or steam them before processing. Again, I'll have a link below to a printable chart for the preps that are needed for different vegetables. If you're working with fruits, sometimes you want to peel them. If you don't peel them, if you're working with something like berries, like blueberries, you do want to check them. It is some way open up the skins so that the moisture inside the berry has a chance, an easier option to escape. For things like apples or pears, you want to use some type of fruit dip, like an acidic medium. Typically I'll use water with a little bit of lemon juice in it, and I'll dip my fruit in that, and that will help prevent your fruit from turning brown. You can use marinades and different flavorings with salt, especially for meats. You know, everybody's familiar with jerky, or almost everybody's familiar with jerky. And I'll have a link to that again down below so you can check out the jerky mix that we typically make. Thinner items will dry faster than thick items. That's pretty well expected. If there's a lot of sugar in something, that's going to increase your drying time. If there's a lot of fat in an item, that's going to increase your drying time, and it's also going to decrease your shelf life. If you are trying to dry in humid conditions, that's going to make your dehydrator work harder, and that's going to increase your dry time. Units with the fans, as I mentioned, I like the fans a lot because the fan will definitely decrease the drying time. I had a friend living in South Carolina. She had an inexpensive unit that she got, didn't have a temperature control, didn't have a fan. She found it difficult to get things to dry before they would mold because she just couldn't crank it up enough to get the job done. Air drying is okay, as I mentioned, under some conditions. As long as it's something, generally plants work better than, I wouldn't try air drying with meats unless you were doing it in combination with smoking or salting or some other factor that increased the likelihood that it would dry quickly and thoroughly. That's more of an advanced thing. But fruit and veggies are pretty easy, pretty reliable. I really think if you think you're going to be doing any amount of dehydrating, at least invest in a small unit like this. If you want to check dryness, one of the things you can do is after you take your food out of your dehydrator, put it in a mason jar and let that sit for a day. If you have condensation on the lid of the jar when you check it the next day, that is not dry enough, and you need to either store that in the fridge and use it rather than later, or you need to put it back in the dehydrator to use more or dry more thoroughly. You should shake that daily, check it for about a week, make sure you're not getting condensation on the inside of that lid. Another option is the hygro lid. This is actually a hygrometer that fits onto a wide mouth mason jar, and that will tell you the relative humidity inside the jar. It's kind of neat, a little bit fun, especially if you got kids like, oh mom, I can read the dial. But the moisture test works just fine. When you get your items out of your dehydrator, you do want to seal them in an airtight container. If you want, you can add a moisture absorber or an oxygen absorber, that kind of thing, to extend shelf life. But airtight container is really important. I usually use mason jars, and then I'll vacuum seal them with my food saver attachment. What else? How long does it last? Typically, I will save dehydrated foods from one season to the next. You can get 2 to 3 years out of it, depending, as long as you've got cool, dry storage conditions. Meat, I try to use within 3 to 6 months. For longer shelf life, you really need to look at something like freeze drying. Well, freeze drying is the king when it comes to shelf life versus any other storage method. With freeze drying, you can store your fruits and vegetables. Sorry about that, getting a little tongue-tied. You can store your fruits and vegetables potentially over 20 years in good storage conditions. Meat, depending on the fat content, you can store for 5, 10 years. You can store dairy, you can store whole meals. So that is really the big difference. Because you get that humidity down by 98 to 99%, those foods are really, really dry, and they will keep a lot longer. All right, we're gonna take a minute here to switch things around, and I'm gonna get some freeze-dried and dehydrated goods so you can see the difference a little bit, and we're gonna go out in the garage and have a look at the freeze dryer. Here I have an example of some dehydrated beans and some freeze-dried beans. Now the dehydrated beans look much like shrinky dinks. Now the great thing about dehydration is that it does shrink your produce. So if you have a lot of produce and not a lot of storage space, it will shrinky dink it so it fits better. So that's a good thing. And then you can cook these in with roast or put them into soups and stews, and they will plump back up. Now these beans were pickled and then freeze dried, and you can see it's not much smaller than a regular bean. They don't tend to shrink up. So if you're looking for space savings, freeze drying doesn't do that, but it does leave a product that will last a really, really long time. And it tends to taste more like fresh beans. In the dehydrating process, this is a more jerky-like item. These taste more like fresh beans, except for really, really dry fresh beans. And these, apple slices are freeze dried, and you can see they just look like a regular apple slice. You know, texture wise, dehydrated item, that's more like leather. Freeze dried item, crisp and light. All right, we are going to go out into the garage and check out the freeze dryer. And this is our freeze dryer. Inside the freeze dryer, I have the medium unit, and mine is an older design. I think it's about 4 years old now, so they've changed it up a little bit. The new display is up here instead of down here, but still works roughly the same. We have the freeze drying chamber, and there's an insulating pad up front. And then there are four individual trays, and I do line mine with reusable parchment paper. It just makes whatever you're working on a lot easier to get off. Then you load this up, and then you check your gasket to make sure it's evenly out all the way around. And your freeze dryer, you can freeze dry an awful lot of stuff. You can do dairy, you can do whole meals, like we do a spaghetti hot dish, you can do soups, you can do yogurt, you can do vegetables, fruits, you name it, you can probably freeze dry it. The only thing it doesn't deal with well is extremely high sugar items like jams and jellies. You can't freeze dry your jams and jellies very well. That's not going to work. Or really high fat items. Don't try to freeze dry butter. It will vaporize and then coat the inside of your freeze dryer, making a really huge mess. Once you've loaded up your contents into your freeze dryer, then you lock it down and you close the valve down here, the drain valve, and you make sure your pump is ready back there. There's a little vacuum pump that sits behind the unit. Some folks set this up on a different type of tray or shelving unit where they have the pump underneath. And then you start it up, you hit start, and then you go through and you select the options that are suited for whatever you're drying. You have an option of liquid versus non-liquid, pre-frozen or not frozen, and all these different things will help the unit determine your dry time by default and then run the cycles appropriately. There is a moisture sensor, so as it's going through the dry cycle, the final dry cycle, it'll start testing whether or not it's pulling moisture off, and that's how it determines when to shut down the cycle. I've had cycles that have gone from as short as about 12 to 13 hours to over 2 days for very sugar heavy items like trying to freeze dry pears in the summertime. Like a dehydrator, it is affected by the heat and humidity levels of the surrounding area. We put ours out in the garage because it does make some noise. It's comparable to a vacuum cleaner because there is a vacuum pump running and there is a little refrigerator unit inside this box, so it does make a low level of noise. So if you can put your unit in a room where you can close the door on it, so much the better. Yeah, then you load it up, let it do its thing, and you come back, you know, a day or less later typically, and then you just unload it, and you want to pack it into Mylar with an oxygen absorber or glass jars with an oxygen absorber. Because you're looking at long-term storage, you don't want to use a vacuum seal packet with the plastic because that is not as airtight as your Mylar bags will be or your glass will be. And that is beginning the skinny on freeze drying. If you have more questions, make sure to leave me a comment below. Otherwise, that's mostly it. I'm happy to help answer any questions you might have, and it's not that hard. If you can follow a recipe, you should be able to dehydrate, you should be able to freeze dry. The big thing is to check and make sure that it's dry at the end and to store it properly. You want cool, dry conditions out of direct sunlight. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you stick around, subscribe. Again, hit me up with any questions. I'm happy to help.